Alright guys, welcome back again. Today we're going to be working on 27.2 Economic Problems and Politics during this lecture. Again, make sure you guys are doing the quizzes at the end of these videos. Make sure that you pay attention, make some notes so that you're prepared to take your test. Alright, so let's get into it. So one of the things that we look at is how does the economic engine of the United States work? Well, remember, we are coming off of, first off, a depression and then into a world war. During both of these times, the United States government has to strictly manage the economy, or not necessarily have to, but they do strictly manage the economy, and they put a lot of controls and constraints and rules in order to kind of make sure the economy follows a rhythmic pattern that they want it to. I mean, when we're talking about World War II, the government really is imposing certain restrictions and imposing certain rules of what factories can and cannot produce in order to aid the war effort. So when we come off of the World War II, though, now we are looking at two ideas that really come to a head, and that is we have the true now economic split between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, with the Democratic Party, you're coming off, and Truman is still president initially. And Truman, again, he's an FDR-type Democrat where he believes in tight government control over the economy, but also an expanded use of taxpayer money to maintain social welfare programs. And so a lot of things that he pushes during his presidency is focused on those types of ideas. On the opposite hand, you have the Republicans at this time, and the Republicans themselves really oppose government intervention on behalf of the economy and on businesses. They really look to loosen regulations and really look at letting the economy naturally work in a traditional cycle of if you have supply, you have demand. Now at the same time, we have to understand that with looser economic rules or sometimes where you get a little bit more fluctuation in the overall economy. However, at the same time, that can also happen under strict control too. So it just kind of depends on your economic views and the economic schools that you go to and you learn from. As always, when I'm teaching you guys, I say develop your own worldview. It's good to read about different economists and their views of how the economy actually works. I'm not going to drive you down one way or another right now. So aside from capitalism is a lot better than communism. That's the only thing I ever promote for you guys, okay? One other thing is too is that during this time, remember we talk about growth of the American economy. Well, at the same time the American economy is growing, the size of government grows. In fact, it grows so much that it takes up 33% of our gross domestic product. And because of this, it puts constraints and kind of imposes a little bit of restrictions on the economy because so much spending is happening for the government itself. So that's why you see kind of these splits where some people are saying, well, look, it's using so much GDP, we could do so much more with that money than what we're doing with it here. And so that's where you start getting some of these ideological splits. So let's talk really quickly, though, about Truman really fast. So Truman, he's a Democrat. And again, like I said, he's from the FDR kind of position where he was a proponent of the New Deal. He himself brings up something called the Fair Deal. That is his initiative that he looks at. He was looking at nationalizing health care across the board. Again, why do we study history? Why do we look at history? Because these are still discussions that we have today. In fact, the idea of nationalizing healthcare goes all the way back to even if you look at like the Bull Moose Party. A lot of people have advocated for universal healthcare for a very long time. This is not a new debate that people are having, but it has happened quite a lot. Also, he was looking to improve housing for lower income people. Remember, we're looking at an economic boom. Lots of people are getting housing at this time, but some of the poorer elements of the American people that are in the American economy cannot afford it. Maybe they did not come back for the military. Maybe they had to stay home because of some sort of disability that kept them from working or some other thing that mustered them out. So not everybody is reaping benefits from the GI Bill at this time, and so Truman's trying to find ways to ensure that they also have access to what he believes is economic prosperity. One of the other things he looks at, and this is something that FDR starts and it continues to be pressed forward, is improving access to Social Security and the number of people that can use Social Security. Again, like I said, do these trends sound familiar? They probably do if you listen to modern politics. There's a talk about expansion and controlling and fixing Social Security. So make sure this is why we study history, guys, so you can kind of see that these debates have happened before and what is the end result of these debates. One thing, though, that he does for some government controls over the economy, first and foremost, introduction of the GI Bill. That helps the economy because it pushes people to buy houses and go to school. Things that drive economic development. Once people own houses, they then have economic security, and then they're more likely to, once they have that house, buy products and consumer goods for that house. Drives the economy quite a bit, immensely. Remember, 11 million homes built during this time frame, and that's a lot of products that need to go in there. The other thing is that they look at price controls. Price controls are putting a limit on how much you can charge for something. That is a government intervention tool that can be used. Mainly price controls were usually in World War II, but sometimes price controls are put in place to help economically disadvantaged individuals. And lastly, one of the ideas they look at is lowering interest rates. Interest rates is typically done through the Federal Reserve. You lower the interest rates. That then lowers the cost of banks being able to borrow money, which then lowers the interest rate towards the consumer. This drives a lot of that credit boon that we talked about in the last chapter, where people have more access to credit at lower payments, is because of the lowering of interest rates. So these are economic controls that are both used by Truman and then also used by our next president we're going to talk about, which is Eisenhower. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit here about some of Truman's policies. With those, especially Republicans, oppose Truman's viewpoints of his social and economic programs. Why? Well, they look at him, and we're coming into an area where we've now defeated Nazi Germany, but remember, we're in the Cold War, so who do we distrust? Soviets. What do we distrust? Communism. And what do they use to attack Truman with? They look at Truman's ideas and his policies and they say, this sounds really socialist. In fact, it sounds kind of communistic. Can we trust Truman? And they use that as their argument against a lot of his policies. They kind of scare the American people and say, hey, we don't want communism in the United States. We're not for that. That's what these social policies, that's where it's going to lead us to if we continue to do that. Again, look at the modern American debate and landscape. Is there talk about improving or making social services or socializing certain elements of the economy? There are. So what are the opposing voices and what do the pro voices say? Is there arguments that this sounds like communism? Does it not sound like communism? Are these same types of debates happening today? Again, yes, if you look at history, it goes in circles quite a bit, where these same debates have already happened and these same views have already come out and there's been arguments for them. So what happens? Well, because of them using these types of language and pushing these types of information, pretty much most of what Truman's policies that he proposes fail in Congress and do not get passed. One thing that he does manage to do, of course, though, is he gets a few bills passed that improves housing for lower income people, allowing the building of some large-scale government housing projects up in Michigan and in a few other locations. So he does get the ability to build some of those projects that he wanted to do. Now, with President Eisenhower, that's where we're going now, he gets elected in on a Republican ticket. And so he goes in and he says, I'm going to remove government interventions on the economy. I'm going to let those controls kind of move to the wayside. And we're going to stimulate and make Americans' economy kind of go in overdrive. That's what he's looking to do anyways. And on top of that, America is coming off of 4 terms of FDR and then 7 years of Truman. So Americans are typically very finicky when they look at changing leaders, where they get to the point where they're like, well, we've had one party rule for so long, let's just give the other party a chance and see what they can do. You'll see this across political elections frequently if you study the 20th century more than anything else too. First thing he does is when he gets in there, he kicks out and he fires 200,000 federal workers to try to reduce the payment towards reduce the federal budget. 200,000 people is a lot of people to remove from office, removed from their jobs. But again, American economy is booming fairly well, so for the most part, a lot of people are going to be able to find jobs in the private sector. So this helps reduce government spending. He also tries to cut out certain elements from social programs that had been established since the FDR administration to try again to reduce government spending. That's one of the things that he's really focused on. He also lowers interest rates, like we just talked about a minute ago, to improve borrowing and access to credit. This helps more people to be able to buy more stuff using credit and going to the bank and getting money for that. One thing he does do, though, is there's a slight economic hiccup. So he is the one that starts that massive interstate highway program that we talk about, where billions upon billions of dollars are invested on infrastructure improvements. This is one of the things that Eisenhower really drives home, is improving the infrastructure of the United States. He also, just like Truman, he saw that there were people that were economically disadvantaged and didn't have access to housing, so he puts in housing policies, and he also does pass some laws to, again, improve Social Security. Social Security has become a critical part of the American economy now. It's what a lot of people retire off of, and a lot of people use that money now in order to ensure that they can make it through retirement. So a lot more people have access to it than ever before. So what's one of the things that really start to drive problems within American society? Well, again, remember what we talked about with the Republicans when they're fighting Truman, is they start using communism as a common tactic to drive fear. Cold War is already doing that. The Soviet Union has massive military and nuclear forces. Now we're afraid that they're trying to infiltrate the United States, and they're trying to take over our government and shape our way of life. This becomes a driving theme throughout the 1950s. We call it the Red Scare during this time. And during this time, Americans look at everybody with suspicion, especially within the government. Government itself, especially members of Congress, really start to say, we think that there's probably communists that are operating within the government, and there's something we need to do about it. We need to start investigating and make sure that there's not spies and moles and people who are trying to subvert our government. That's one of the key points you guys want to remember: subversion. That's what they think is going to happen here, that they're going to get in high places and they're going to try to bring the American government down, or the American system down in general. So what does Truman first do to try to curb communist activities? Well, he really pushes the FBI and the Department of Justice to start looking into it and investigating people. This is where you find J. Edgar Hoover really gets his power, and how he's able to hold on being the director of the FBI for so long is that he starts to investigate everybody. He gets a very wide berth to kind of dig into everybody's personal and private life. If you'd ever done anything bad in your life, J. Edgar Hoover probably knew about it, and that's why nobody dared to fight J. Edgar Hoover during this time frame. He knew all the secrets, he knew where all the skeletons were, and he knew where all the bodies were buried. So he's giving unprecedented amounts of power during this time frame to look for and try to ferret out communists throughout the U.S. government. At least that's what they were looking for. The other thing is that there was a committee called the House on Un-American Activities. And so this committee's job was to investigate Americans who were trying to subvert the United States and the United States way of life. These people were responsible for holding investigation and questioning people. It had been around since World War II, but it really gains power and momentum here in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. A lot of it is staffed by conservatives. We're usually Republicans in nature. There are conservative Democrats. Don't get me wrong. So you have both types of people on there. This is where you start to see the rise of Richard Nixon, and you also see McCarthy come out of this time frame too. So Nixon becomes very important later on, so it's good to kind of know who Richard Nixon is during this time frame. What they did, though, is that they start to investigate different groups, everybody from government officials to their reach starts to go out towards Hollywood. They start to investigate actors and writers and producers, people they think that might be making pro-Soviet propaganda. A lot of people in Hollywood were accused of being communists and had to come before the committee and answer questions. And so lots of big name Hollywood celebrities at the time have to show up and testify. Many of them did not like this behavior and they felt it was a violation of their rights, and so a lot of them invoked their Fifth Amendment rights, which doesn't necessarily help them when it comes down to if you're being asked if you're a communist or not. And so some of the people that were involved in this and that were asked these questions, if they refused to give answers or it was thought that they were a communist, they were placed on something called the Black Book. In this Black Book, you would be, it's not a physical book, by the way, guys. I know when you're thinking it's a book. It's not like they printed a book and they pass it around to everybody, but that's the terminology they used for it. Basically, you'd be placed into it saying that you're a dangerous communist and that nobody should hire you. And so lots of actors lost the ability to work in Hollywood for up to 15 years while these black books were kind of being circulated about who they believed were in part of the communist plot against America. That's kind of where we're going with this one. And so during this time frame, one of the people who get caught up in this web is Alger Hiss, who was a State Department employee, and he was accused of selling secrets to the Soviet Union by another individual in the State Department who claimed that they had the goods on the microfilms that he was transferring into a hollow pumpkin or some weird thing like that. And he was brought before this council and he was grilled. He was grilled and he had to go to court, and the trial evidence was flimsy at best. You know, the microfilm never appeared that was said that was to be there. Eventually he is, I mean, again, the anti-communist hysteria is so high that he's convicted and he's actually sent to prison. He spends quite a few years in prison until he's eventually pardoned for it because, again, the evidence that convicted him and sent him to jail was very thin. It was just a matter of them saying you were a communist, and that was pretty much enough to end his career. Our next ones, though, that also fall into this web are the Rosenbergs. That's Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And they were accused of being spies for the Soviet Union. And the main thing that they're tied to is giving the Soviet Union enough information to build an atomic bomb. That is their most notorious claim to fame, is that they are the ones who gave away the secrets to the nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb, to the Soviet Union. Now, lots of what's looked over is that, yes, you know, most historians do agree that they were engaged in spying for the Soviet Union. Did they necessarily give the secrets to the atomic weapons to the Soviet Union? There's no definitive proof that they gave them that specific information and were responsible for it occurring. Now, what happens again, though, is they do actually get convicted of engaging in spying for the Soviet Union. And they are actually the only Americans in peacetime that are executed for being spies. So that's what happens to them. They actually get accused of being spies and they get convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. Sorry if you hear that background noise. Somebody's decided to print something down here. Hang on one moment. All right, there we go. So what is the next big movement in this? Well, what you have next is Senator Joseph McCarthy. He is from Wisconsin, and he starts to hold trials in the Senate. Not necessarily trials, but more so question and answer sessions. And he would drag everybody he could before him. And he stated to everybody, I have a list of 205 communists that I know who are working in the State Department, and we're going to ferret out every single one of them, and we're going to end the scourge of Sovietism. And so he holds all these public trials, and these trials are broadcast across television. Everybody sees them. And it becomes this big movement in the United States to really fight against communism. That's, you know, the fear is out there. We got to make sure we find all the communists and get rid of them. So that's what he's looking at doing. And, you know, he holds these hearings and everything like that. But one of the things is that often McCarthy would just accuse people and have zero evidence to back up any of his accusations or claims. And because of that, he creates all sorts of fear-mongering, and he'd drag anybody who could be a political enemy or a personal enemy against him and be able to ruin them politically. or he'd be able to drive him out of a job. And this becomes what's known as McCarthyism. So he's able to just make wild claims and accusations against somebody's loyalty against the United States and they're being a communist and ruin them. He, however, goes one step too far and he starts to accuse some soldiers of being communists without any proof or evidence. This forces Eisenhower, who has historically been able to back McCarthy in his hunt, to turn on McCarthy and say that you are in the wrong. And eventually he gets censored by the United States Senate and he loses a lot of his power and authority and he eventually loses his access to his office. He gets voted out. And so this kind of ends the McCarthyism ideas. So with the end of McCarthyism, you start to see the real end and close of what we call the Red Scare. And this ends up because the Korean War ends, so you see communism is being held at the line. The government agencies never really find any actual spies throughout all these hearings and all these movements and all these trials. So no spies are ever ferreted out from any of these places, with all these people being accused of being spies against the United States. There was no idea, the government found no real proof of Soviet subversion in the American government. They didn't find a bunch of communists running around trying to destroy the United States government from within. So again, since there's nobody that they were able actually to find and convict and put into jail, this kind of ends everybody's fear that there are communists everywhere trying to overthrow the government. One of the ultimate impacts of McCarthyism, though, and the Red Scare is that it really shuts people down from saying bad things about the American government for fear of them being accused of being a communist. So people become more quiet and they're not quite as open about talking negatively about the government for those fears. All right, guys. Well, that ends 27.2. Remember to do the quiz after this, and then I will see you tomorrow with more videos.